This episode of SalmonCast is sponsored by Pride of Bristol Bay. From our nets to your door, we provide you with sockeye salmon in fillets and portions in 5, 10, and 20-pound cases. Podcast listeners get 10% off their first order when you use the code PODCAST at checkout. That's prideofbristolbay.com, promo code PODCAST. Welcome to SalmonCast, the podcast featuring wild adventures fueled by wild seafood. Today on the podcast, we have Jenn and Steve Kurian. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks,
First time. And today we're going to start by going through some history of the company and give our listeners and fans some insight as to how the two of you started all of these businesses that we feature on the channel. And before we get to that, though, we are starting this episode with a You Ask, We Answer segment where you submit questions about salmon, seafood, or the wild adventure lifestyle, and we answer your questions on the show. So we'll start with Steve. The first question, Steve, is how long does frozen salmon last in the freezer?
Well, today with the vacuum pack technology, basically all salmon is stamped with a 2-year shelf life mark on there. We highly recommend that you consume it within the year that it was caught in for the best taste. And, all salmon is created equally. It's not cared for equally. But so if you're starting with a very good product up front and it's harvested, refrigerated, taken care of through that process, filleted, vacuum packed in a nice sturdy vacuum pack, we guarantee our product for the full year because we know that people taking that product out at that year mark are still going to be delighted with the quality of it. And so one of the things that we show people is as when you buy a case of salmon and you've got it in your freezer, you want to make sure none of those plastic vacuum seals open because that's what the number one problem that can occur and deteriorate the quality of the salmon while it's in the freezer is an open vac pack. So we kind of like keep it in the box that it comes in and don't root around in your freezer and clink them together and break the seals. And if you do that and make sure that the seals are kept shut, and if you do find one that opens up, like you just use that one first before it freezer burns, and it's great. But if it sits in there all season, you can end up with a freezer burn product. But the technology from when I started 19 years ago to now in the vac pack world is just changed so much that you get to enjoy the just off the boat taste at that year mark.
An interesting thing I was just thinking about, do you guys at your house organize your salmon in your freezer a certain way so you kind of have it organized by what year it is?
Well, we never have anything that's older than a year in the freezer just because we use it.
Okay.
But I typically organize the freezer closest to the kitchen with a variety of different things.
Okay.
So I'll take it out of the box and put one or two in the freezer in the kitchen, so I have it there for quick use. But the rest of the majority of the fillets or portions that we have at home are in the box in the chest freezer.
Okay.
Yeah, and if we ever do run product over a year, it happens, and I'll just use that for smoking or canning and use the freshest stuff for your sashimi grade or, just medium rare, and then you just kind of work backwards from that.
So it's kind of like that, the adage of like milk, just because the date expired doesn't mean that it just couldn't be used for another use.
Yeah, we get customers all the time that'll be like, using up their last fillet from the year prior, and it'll be October, November, and they're just like, wow, it was really good. And so, it's a year and 4 months old, and, they don't see the difference. And, we always recommend that you use it right away within that year. But if it does roll over, there's plenty of great recipes out there that you can use it for.
Cool. Next question is kind of the next step in the process. Jenn, how long does frozen salmon take to thaw?
Well, typically the food safety guideline is they recommend pulling it out the night before, putting it in your refrigerator, and putting a little slice in the plastic, allowing air to get in there. I don't operate that way. I'm very last minute when it comes to dinner. So I tend to pull it right from the freezer and put it in a cold water bath in the sink for, 10, 15, 20 minutes. And then I'm ready to rock and roll.
Cool. Easy enough. So we'll jump in to today's topic portion. How you guys met, and I'm anxious to hear this because I don't think I've ever heard the story. So, it always seems to be two different perspectives. So, let's start with Jen and how you remember.
Let Steve tell the story.
Steve, do you want to start?
No, I want to see how good her memory is.
All right, Jen. Let's see how good your memory is.
Well, so we met in middle school. For the first time, but we started dating way back in high school, 9th grade. I think it was science class, something of that nature. And
wow, must have left a really good impression. So I can go into a little more detail there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, so 9th grade science class, and we had shared the same table, and so we got to chit-chatting a bit more, and we would bet over, it was the Dallas Cowboys games. I think that was the thing. Neither of us were really football fans, or like,
that was just the excuse.
It was the excuse to and so we were always betting, and they had a running series back then, a string, and so it was kind of like, that was the piece that made us talk to each other, I think.
Do you remember what your first date was, like when you guys first went out?
No, the very first date that I can remember is just right next door at the Cinema Center. Right. Her dad took us in his company work truck and dropped us off to see Cliffhanger, was it?
Oh, wow.
Wow, your memory is much better than mine.
That's a great memory.
and then we were we used to, when he'd take us somewhere, we'd play with the CB in the truck, faking that it was
right,
real.
So did you, as you got a little bit older, getting ready to go to college, say later high school years, when did you two start going outside and doing adventures and trips and things like that together? And do you remember one of those early times that you started to participate in some outdoor activities?
We always really did outdoor activities, whether it was hiking or skiing. I think we were both part of the ski club. Lots of outdoor things. But one of our earliest adventures was a trip to the Appalachian, to the Adirondacks. Sorry,
yeah,
the Adirondacks in a canoe. Camp trip.
I've got an early picture of back when I had the international pickup with wood sides. You dressed up in orange. We went squirrel hunting. I took her squirrel hunting for the first time.
Okay.
So that had to have been a high school outing, and it's real classic picture.
If you can find that picture so we can put it up right now, that would be great. Cool. And then as you started to go or graduate high school, tell us a little bit about what your interests were at the time and what you decided to study. And I guess I don't even really know the answer to this, but did you guys both go to the same college, or you went to two different schools?
No, we went to two different schools. Jen went to Millersville University in kind of southeast PA or south central PA, and I went to Williamsport. Wasn't the community college; it was Penn College at that time.
Okay,
it used to be called the community college. So I went for forest technology, and basically I was cutting timber. The last 2 years of high school, I was working weekends cutting timber for a neighbor of mine, and you go to the guidance counselor, and they're like, "Well, what do you like?" And so they're like, "Wow, it seems like you want to be outdoors." So went up and took a look at the school and decided, all right, well, this is what I'll give a try to for a 2-year degree.
Jen?
Yeah, so I ended up at Millersville University with a degree in teaching, elementary education, and I've always been big into sports and through high school, played a couple different sports. And when I got to Millersville, I played lacrosse. And so sort of worked lacrosse and the teaching and finished my degree and ended up staying in that Lancaster area. Did some subbing and refereeing lacrosse and things of that sort. So then the first teaching job I took actually was in the school district of Lancaster in the inner city, which was really great. Neat opportunity. So 3 years, I think I taught there, and got tenure and switched to come home at that point. We had bought a piece of property and we're going to build a house, and so sort of switched gears a few years after college.
And what about you, Steve? What did you do after college?
Well, I didn't play any sports because I my goal was to pay for college as I went. So I started switched from cutting trees, logging, to climbing trees, and I started kind of Kurian tree service. I don't even know what we called it back then. Just pick up chuck and a chainsaw, and then got through Penn College, and Jen was still in school, and I took a job with the U.S. Forest Service in Utah. I went out to Utah for the Forest Service, took a forest tech position, and was doing timber marking, that kind of thing, firefighting for that summer. And then Jen came out, and we went to the Tetons and Yellowstone. And then Jen came home, and then I drove home shortly after and so I decided that I needed to, I think I was making like $12.50 an hour. So I knew that if I wanted to like get a better job than that, I had to have a better degree. So Jen was still in school. So I was like, well, I'm going to go to Penn State and get my 4-year degree. So I went back to school at Penn State and got my 4-year degree. And then when I graduated from Penn State, then I moved to Idaho to take a job with the Idaho Department of Lands in their forestry department.
And when you were working in Idaho, did you live out there with him, or were you still back in Pennsylvania while he was out working there?
I was there in the summertime.
Okay.
I think that was the summer before. It was the summer after college had ended and before my real job started.
Okay.
My first real job of teaching. So that was, August of who knows what year.
2001.
2001, yeah. So I spent the summer in Idaho.
Okay.
Until it was time to go to work.
So, Steve, tell us about the gentleman that you met while you were out in Idaho.
Yeah, so Hunt Hatch, it turned out that one of the Penn State advisors had a connection to a guy at the Department of Lands, and through that connection, we were able to find an apartment for myself to stay in, and that one of the other foresters had stayed in. And so I was like, great, made the connection, drove out there, and went up, met the family. And Hunt was, at that time, he had just retired from commercial airline pilot. And it turned out that he was he was a forestry grad. He was a smoke jumper for a while. Then he was a fighter pilot and got into commercial fishing and also commercial airline pilot. And so he had this really outdoors lifestyle, adventurous, and it was the first time I was really around anybody like that. And, coming out of central Pennsylvania, kind of just a tight-knit family, just a different way of thinking. So him and I became really good friends. All his kids were out of the house, and so he was kind of really looking for somebody to pal around with. And he had a big tree farm, and he was always pruning trees. And so he pretty much, after the full year of living there and deciding that I didn't want to take the full-time job with the Department of Lands, and Hunt talked me into going to Alaska to fish with him and do set netting in Bristol Bay. So, and he's totally sold it. Like, this is the greatest thing. You're going to make tons of money. It's like, super awesome. And I was up for the adventure. So I gave up my state job and drove home back to Pennsylvania. Then that winter, my cousin and I were muzzleloader hunting like for the month of January. I think we hunted half the month, and he quit his job, and we decided to go to Alaska together the next spring. So we took an old snowmobile trailer and like built a plywood shed on top of it and drove to Alaska. And we got there, we worked carpentry for the first month, and we were in Anchorage. And then once June rolled around, then I flew to Bristol Bay and started to get the set net camp together.
And what was your reaction, Jen, when he had expressed that he was going to go do this, being from Pennsylvania, and then like the difference of what commercial fishing in Alaska versus living and working here, or even in Idaho, is a pretty big difference. So what were some of your early thoughts when he mentioned he was going to do this, and then eventually you went along as well?
I don't know. I guess I'm always, I'm up for pretty much any adventure, but maybe I just didn't realize what it was, I didn't know how different it was. And so there really wasn't any hesitation. It was, if that's a passion and something you want to do, then let's do it.
So when did you go up?
I went up that first summer because I had finished a year of teaching. And so at the end of school, beginning of June or so, flew up to Bristol Bay directly. Steve had already been there and intended to just spend the summer on the beach in the cabin, not necessarily to commercial fish. But as it turns out, the neighbor next door was looking for a deckhand, or not a deckhand, but I guess...
Just a hand.
Yeah, a hand. On the boats, they're not deckhand. But needed some help, and so I ended up working for the neighbor in the cabin next door, basically on the same tides that Steve was working, not too far away, different sites, but...
So what was your first year like working on the boat?
On the boat or in the set net?
Sorry, in the set net.
Yeah, so the set net camp is, set nets are where they anchor the net to the beach and then an anchor out in the water, and they're perpendicular to the beach. And so then you use a little skiff and you put the net onto the skiff and you pull it across the sides of the gunnel and you shake the fish out, and it's real kind of low key. You only catch what swims by your sight. But it was a pretty poor run at that year, 20. It was a pretty poor run in 2002, which was the first season. And so we didn't fish a lot. And we ended up goofing around and doing more exploring and beach combing, looking for artifacts on the beach. And then, it was just kind of a fun time with a bit of work. It wasn't as hard as a normal season would be, but we got to explore.
So what was it that sparked you to go back? Both of you.
It was just a raw adventure. At 23, 24, Alaska adventure. Alaska is always in my dreams, hunting, fishing. And we went and did some sport fishing. Jen hooked me right in the eyelid with a treble hook. That was one of her great casting moments.
I thought you were going to say proudest moments.
Like I had a treble hook in my eyelid. But it was just like at that time you didn't really you didn't own anything. You were kind of adventurous. You were looking for your path in life.
Yeah, there's nothing tying you down at that time. So it was, why not?
Right. So when did you make the decision, or how quickly did you make the decision that we're going to go back next year?
I don't think I intended to go back the following year because I started working on my master's degree.
Okay.
But I think that is the year that I ended up going anyway.
We had a deckhand that fell apart, and then I called you. They're like, who do you know that can come and do this work? And I'm like, Jen. I'm like, my right hand. So Yeah, I don't know. And I mean, like, as I look back over the years, like typically you leave Bristol Bay and you're like, this place sucks. Like you just worked your tail off, you know, it's been long days, cold, wet. But then like February, March comes around and you just like start jonesing for the place and the geese start flying north and you're like, gotta go.
Interesting. So the second year or the following year, then you both went up to work on the boat itself, right? As deckhands?
Yeah, I went up to SetNet, and then the Hunt son, Bryce, he had bought a second boat and permit for his stepson, and they had a problem, and they needed somebody to put the permit, to hold the permit in their name. And so Hunt was like, you can trust Steve because you end up putting these permits in that person's name as like they own it and they're valuable. So the way around that is they kind of put it in your name and it's your obligation to give it back to them in a sense. And so they put it in my name because they could trust me. And then they were going to find a boat captain, but they couldn't find anybody to run the boat. So they're like, can you run the boat? Do you think you can run the boat? And I was like, I can run a bulldozer and a log skidder. Like, give it a try. Like, it's funny, right? But it's like, I was like, sure, why not? You know, and growing up, going to New Jersey to the coast, my dad loves to sport fish. You know, we had an 18-foot mud walloper, which is just an aluminum boat and, you know, a little outboard on it. And like, so in my brain, it was like, well, it's the same thing. Like, I can do this. And so the first season I ran it on the shoulders of the busy time. When it was really busy, we anchored it up and just fished one boat. And then on the shoulders where it wasn't as busy and we could split the crew, we split, and then I ran the boat.
So what was your first season like on the boat as a deckhand?
It was not a great season. I think there's just because it was new to everyone. I don't know that the boat was top notch. So, you know, there were a lot of setbacks, but I think that given that it was the first opportunity, I think we did pretty darn well, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we kept our job.
Yeah.
You know, we were running it for somebody else. So, yeah, I mean, I think like the early days of for us, anybody in Bristol Bay and in old boats is just, it's a arm wrestling match to keep the boat running, to figure out what you're doing, to learn. Like the landscape was so vast to me. Like you're on the edge of the Bering Sea. And now I look back at it and I'm like, I get it all. Like I've been over every piece of it. You're not scared of the sandbars and what the current does. But like when you're first on the water, like you have no idea what a trailing sea is. And when, you know, like when you're driving away from a trailing sea and it hits the back of the boat and spins the boat sideways because the force of the wave, like you don't know what's going to go on. And
now that you've been a captain for how many years now? 19 years. How rare is it that someone would go from set netting their first year to like actually running a boat the second year that they're there?
Yeah, I think that's pretty rare. You know, most people are, you know, they grow up in it. They're deckhand for 4 or 5, 6 years. Their captain lets them run the boat, you know, on the shoulders or like when they're going to the tender or whatever. And then, you know, they buy their own boat. They get the courage up to buy their own boat. I am thankful for the way we got into it because it's kind of like when you're thrown in the fire, you really like, you have to dig in. It's sink or swim. And that was like, I think what really allowed me to kind of like quickly pick it up, and the guys that were within our radio group were really hardcore, and everybody was kind of like cheering me along, and you know, so it drove me to perform at a higher level, and I am a pretty competitive person. You know, I love sports, but I just chose not to do them in college because I felt like I needed to work, and so this was like, it's a combination of that competitive sports and work program.
Tune in next week for part 2 of our discussion with Steve and Jenn. SalmonCast is a production of Kurian Fisheries. The show is hosted by Steve Kurian and Dustin Hamilton. Produced by Dustin Hamilton, Courtney Rainford, and Aubrey McNeil.